You are being taxed every single day, and almost no one has ever explained it to you honestly. Not through income tax. Not through sales tax. Not through anything that shows up clearly on your paycheck. This tax does not require a vote. It does not require a law passed in Parliament. It does not even require an announcement. And yet it quietly works its way into your life, shrinking what you earn, hollowing out what you save, and quietly transferring your future to someone else. Most people experience it as confusion. They notice that groceries feel more expensive. Rent rises faster than their salary. Savings that once felt secure suddenly feel fragile. And they are told this is just how the economy works. But inflation is not an accident. It is not a force of nature, like gravity or weather. It is a political choice, one of the oldest and most effective tools of power ever invented. Inflation is a tax that hides in plain sight. Unlike traditional taxes, it does not provoke resistance. No one receives a bill labeled inflation tax. It's sanction of the contact a video. There are no protests demanding lower inflation rates. Instead, the cost is spread thinly across millions of people, just enough that each individual feels pain, but not enough to spark rebellion. That is precisely why governments throughout history have relied on it. When states face war, debt, or political promises they cannot afford, inflation becomes the solution that avoids confrontation. Print more money. Let prices rise. Pay yesterday's obligations with tomorrow's weaker currency. The burden does not disappear. It simply shifts from governments to savers, from institutions to households, from the present to the future. This hidden tax quietly rewards those who understand the system and punishes those who trust it. And once you recognize inflation for what it really is, a mechanism of wealth transfer disguised as economics, it becomes impossible to unsee. Because this story is not new. It did not begin in the modern era. It has been repeated for thousands of years, across empires, revolutions, democracies, and financial crises. And every time, the same question returns. If inflation is so damaging, why do governments keep using it? To answer that, we have to go back, not to spreadsheets or theories, but to history, where this hidden tax was first perfected. To understand why inflation is not an accident, we have to look at the moment when rulers first realized it could be used as a weapon. The Roman Empire did not collapse because its leaders were ignorant of money. It collapsed because they understood money too well. For centuries, Rome paid its soldiers in silver denarii, coins trusted across the Mediterranean world. A denarius was not valuable because Caesar's face was stamped on it. It was valuable because it contained real silver. Trust in the currency was trust in the metal itself. But empires are expensive. Legions needed wages. Borders needed defense. Wars needed to be fought without end. Raising taxes openly was dangerous. Roman citizens resisted. Elites complained. Revolts followed. So emperors found a quieter solution. They reduced the silver content of the coins. At first, the change was subtle. A little copper mixed in. The coin looked the same. It weighed almost the same. The stamp of authority was unchanged. Most people did not notice, but the state could now mint more coins from the same amount of silver. Soldiers were paid. Debts were settled. The empire survived another year. This was inflation in its earliest form. Over decades, the process accelerated. Coins grew lighter, thinner, cheaper. Prices rose. Merchants demanded more coins for the same goods. Trust began to erode. By the 3rd century, the denarius was nearly worthless. Trade reverted to barter. Gold disappeared from circulation. Ordinary Romans paid the price, not through declared taxes, but through the silent destruction of their money. Rome fell, but the method survived. Centuries later, revolutionary France rediscovered the same trick. Facing bankruptcy and political chaos, the government issued paper money called assignats, supposedly backed by confiscated church land. At first, the idea seemed modern and clever. Paper was easier than metal. Printing was faster than taxation. Politicians promised restraint. They lied. As more notes were printed, prices exploded. Bread riots filled the streets of Paris. Farmers refused paper money. Savings evaporated. Once again, the government did not raise taxes. It inflated them into existence. Then came Weimar Germany, the most extreme lesson of all. Crushed by war debts and reparations, the German state turned to the printing press. By 1923, money lost value by the hour. Workers were paid twice a day. Savings accumulated over lifetimes were wiped out in months. Children stacked banknotes like toys. A loaf of bread cost billions. And yet, instead of abandoning inflation forever, governments around the world learned a different lesson. Not that inflation was dangerous, but that it was powerful. Because when used carefully, inflation does not provoke revolt. It provokes confusion. And confusion is a form of control. Inflation is often described as a general rise in prices, as if it affects everyone equally. It does not. Inflation is not neutral. It does not spread pain evenly across society. It redistributes wealth deliberately and predictably from one group to another. To understand inflation, you have to stop thinking like a consumer and start thinking like a balance sheet. When money loses value, anyone who holds money loses. When money loses value, anyone who owes money wins. This is the core mechanism. Governments are the largest debtors in every modern economy. They borrow to fund wars, welfare systems, infrastructure, and political promises. When inflation rises, the real value of that debt shrinks. Yesterday's trillion-dollar obligation is repaid with today's weaker currency. From the state's perspective, inflation is not a crisis. It is relief. Now consider banks and large financial institutions. They do not sit on piles of idle cash. They operate through leverage, loans, and assets. Inflation inflates the nominal value of those assets while eroding the real burden of liabilities. Real estate rises. Stocks reprice upward. Hard assets appreciate. Meanwhile, savers lose quietly. A household that does everything right by conventional advice, working, saving, avoiding debt, finds itself punished. Cash savings earn 1 or 2% interest while inflation runs at 4 or 5%. Every year, purchasing power bleeds away. That loss does not disappear. It moves. It moves toward borrowers, asset holders, and governments. This is why inflation consistently widens inequality. Those who already own assets benefit from rising prices. Those who depend on wages and savings fall behind. This is not a conspiracy. It is arithmetic. Inflation also protects political power. Raising taxes openly triggers backlash. People understand taxes. They can see them. They can organize against them. Inflation, by contrast, feels abstract. People argue about causes. They blame corporations, supply chains, immigrants, weather, wars. The state remains distant from blame. This diffusion of responsibility is the true genius of inflation. Central banks sit at the center of this system. Officially independent, they are tasked with maintaining price stability. In practice, they are pressured to support governments, stabilize markets, and prevent financial collapse. When crises hit, wars, recessions, pandemics, restraint disappears. Money creation accelerates. New terms are invented to soften the reality. Quantitative easing, liquidity injections, emergency facilities. The language is technical, but the effect is simple. More money, less value per unit. Those closest to the creation of money benefit first. Banks, corporations, and financial markets receive liquidity before prices adjust. By the time inflation reaches groceries and rent, the gains have already been captured. This is known as the Cantillon effect, though most people experience it without knowing the name. It explains why asset prices surge while wages lag, why stock markets rally during money printing while living costs climb months later. Inflation is not chaos. It follows channels of power. This is why governments fear deflation far more than inflation. Deflation increases the real burden of debt. It punishes borrowers. It exposes fiscal weakness. Inflation hides it. And this is why every modern state insists that some inflation is healthy. Is for Manning, 2% sounds harmless, technical, manageable. But over time, even small inflation compounds. It slowly confiscates value from those who trust money as a store of wealth. Inflation is not theft in the dramatic sense. It is erosion. And erosion favors those standing on solid ground while sweeping away those standing still. Once you see who benefits, the mystery of inflation disappears. The question becomes not whether inflation is intentional, but how far governments are willing to push it before people notice. Inflation does not arrive all at once, and it does not strike everyone equally or simultaneously. It moves through the economy in stages, following channels of power and proximity to money creation. This is what makes it so difficult to recognize and so effective. When governments spend more than they collect, they borrow. When borrowing becomes politically or financially constrained, central banks step in. They do not usually print physical cash. Instead, they create digital money, expanding balance sheets with a keystroke. This money enters the system at specific points. Banks receive reserves. Financial institutions receive liquidity. Governments fund deficits at lower real cost. At this stage, nothing looks like inflation to ordinary people. There are no higher grocery bills yet. No visible price spikes. In fact, things can feel calm, even prosperous. Markets rise. Asset prices climb. Credit becomes easier. This is inflation's first phase. Asset inflation. Stocks rally not because companies suddenly became more productive, but because there is more money chasing financial instruments. Real estate prices rise because cheap credit pushes buyers into competition. Luxury goods, art, collectibles, and speculative assets surge. Those closest to capital benefit first. Months later, the second phase begins. As asset holders feel wealthier, spending increases. Corporations with access to cheap financing expand. Governments continue spending. Demand begins to press against supply. Only now do consumer prices start to move. Food costs rise. Energy prices creep upward. Rent increases. This is when inflation becomes visible to the public, but by this point, the redistribution has already occurred. Wages respond last. Labor markets are sticky. Salaries are negotiated slowly. Contracts lag behind price changes. Workers realize their purchasing power has fallen only after the damage is done. This delay is not accidental. It is structural. Inflation rewards speed and punishes delay. Those who receive new money early gain purchasing power. Those who receive it late lose. Central banks claim they can control this process. They publish targets. 2% inflation. Price stability. Soft landings. But these targets mask a deeper reality. Inflation is not just about prices. It is about debt management. High debt systems require inflation to function. Without it, debts grow heavier in real terms. Governments would face hard choices: raise taxes, cut spending, default. Inflation avoids all three. This is why inflation often accelerates after major crises. Wars, financial collapses, pandemics, these events justify extraordinary spending. Extraordinary spending justifies extraordinary money creation. And once the money exists, it rarely disappears. When inflation becomes politically uncomfortable, central banks raise interest rates. This is the visible act of discipline. But higher rates come with consequences. Businesses slow investment. Unemployment rises. Recessions follow. This creates political pressure to reverse course. Rates are cut. Liquidity returns. Inflation resumes. The system oscillates between excess and restraint, but the long-term trend is clear. Money loses value over time. This is not a failure of policy. It is the policy. Inflation also reshapes behavior. People learn not to save in cash. They speculate. They chase returns. They take on debt because debt becomes cheaper in real terms. Society becomes more leveraged, more fragile, more dependent on constant monetary intervention. This dependency gives central banks extraordinary power. Their statements move markets. Their decisions determine winners and losers. Their credibility becomes a national asset. Yet they remain largely unaccountable to voters. This is the final mechanism of inflation. Distance. Distance between cause and effect. Distance between decision makers and consequences. Distance between responsibility and blame. Inflation feels like something that happens to people, not something done to them. And as long as it feels that way, the system endures. But history shows that when inflation crosses a certain threshold, when the erosion becomes too obvious, the illusion breaks. That is when inflation stops being a hidden tax and becomes a political crisis. Every inflationary system has a limit. For a long time, inflation works precisely because it is subtle. Prices rise slowly. Explanations sound plausible. Supply chains, energy shocks, global events, the story is always complicated enough to diffuse blame. But there comes a moment when inflation stops feeling abstract and starts feeling personal. That moment is the breaking point. History shows that inflation becomes politically dangerous not when prices rise, but when trust collapses. Trust that money will hold value. Trust that work will be rewarded. Trust that tomorrow will not be worse than today. In the United States during the 1970s, this breaking point arrived gradually. Then all at once, inflation pushed into double digits. Wages could not keep up. Mortgage rates exploded. Families realized that saving was pointless and borrowing was terrifying. The hidden tax became visible. For the first time in decades, inflation dominated political conversation. Not because economists warned about it, but because households lived it. Grocery bills became evidence. Gas lines became symbols. Confidence eroded. The response was brutal. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to nearly 20%. It crushed inflation, but it also crushed the economy. Businesses failed. Unemployment surged. Entire industries collapsed. The lesson governments absorbed was not that inflation must be avoided at all costs. The lesson was that inflation must be managed just below the threshold of revolt. This is the tightrope modern states walk. Inflation that is too low risks debt deflation and fiscal crisis. Inflation that is too high risks political backlash. So authorities attempt to control perception as much as reality. They adjust measurement formulas. They substitute goods in inflation baskets. They emphasize core inflation over lived inflation. Official numbers remain calm, while daily life feels expensive. This gap between statistics and experience is where trust erodes fastest. The 2008 financial crisis marked another breaking point, though it took a different form. Instead of consumer price inflation, governments unleashed massive monetary expansion through quantitative easing. Trillions were created to save banks, stabilize markets, and prevent systemic collapse. Inflation did not show up immediately in consumer prices. It showed up in assets. Stocks surged. Real estate exploded. Wealth concentrated at the top. Ordinary savers were told inflation was low and stable. But they could not afford homes. They could not build wealth. They sensed the system was rigged, even if they could not articulate how. This was inflation without inflation, the hidden tax operating through asset prices instead of groceries. Then came the pandemic. In 2020, governments crossed a line that had previously been theoretical. Direct money creation funded direct payments at unprecedented scale. Deficits no longer mattered. Debt limits vanished. Digital money flowed freely. For a brief moment, it felt painless. Then reality arrived. By 2021 and 2022, inflation surged across energy, food, housing, and transportation. What had been abstract became undeniable. Middle-class households felt poorer month by month. This time, the explanations rang hollow. Inflation was no longer invisible. It was no longer polite. It was no longer deniable. This is the danger zone for any monetary system. Because once people stop trusting money, behavior changes rapidly. Savings disappear. Capital flees. Barter emerges. Foreign currencies replace domestic ones. Social contracts fracture. Weimar Germany collapsed not because inflation existed, but because trust evaporated. Lebanon collapsed not because debt was high, but because citizens realized deposits were fiction. Inflation, once exposed, destroys legitimacy. This is why governments fear inflation more than almost any other economic force, not because it hurts growth, but because it threatens authority. The hidden tax works only as long as it remains hidden. Once seen, it demands accountability. When inflation becomes persistent, societies adapt but not equally. History shows a clear divide between those who understand inflation as a structural force and those who trust money to behave the way it always has. Survival is not about intelligence or effort. It is about positioning. In ancient Rome, the citizens who survived monetary collapse were not the ones hoarding debased coins. They were the ones who quietly accumulated real silver, gold, and land. Currency failed. Assets endured. In Weimar Germany, those with foreign currency accounts, farmland, or property preserved wealth. Civil servants, teachers, and professionals who trusted bank savings were wiped out. In the 1970s, inflation punished savers and rewarded borrowers. Homeowners with fixed-rate mortgages saw the real value of their debt shrink. Renters and cash holders fell behind. Commodities, real estate, and hard assets absorbed inflation while wages lagged. The pattern repeats with unsettling consistency. Inflation rewards those who move first. It punishes those who wait. It destroys the value of promises while preserving the value of control. This is why inflation reshapes behavior across entire societies. People stop saving. They speculate. They chase returns not because they are greedy, but because holding cash becomes irrational. Debt becomes attractive. Liquidity becomes power. Stability becomes illusion. Governments understand this dynamic intimately. Despite public warnings about inflation, they rely on it. Inflation is embedded into fiscal planning, debt sustainability models, and political promises. A system built on debt cannot survive prolonged price stability. This dependency creates a moral hazard. States promise discipline while quietly relying on erosion. Central banks speak of independence while coordinating implicitly with fiscal authorities. When inflation threatens credibility, governments respond with narratives, not structural reform. They tell citizens inflation is temporary. They blame external shocks. They promise normalization. Meanwhile, the incentives remain unchanged. The cost of stopping inflation is recession, unemployment, and political pain. The cost of allowing inflation is distributed quietly across millions. Faced with this choice, states consistently choose inflation. Individuals, however, face a different reality. Those who adapt treat money as a tool, not a store of value. They diversify into assets that respond to inflation. They minimize exposure to long-term fixed cash holdings. They understand that risk is not volatility, but erosion. Those who do not adapt experience inflation as betrayal. They worked, saved, and trusted institutions and were punished for it. This is why inflation fractures societies psychologically. It destroys the moral link between effort and reward. In countries like Argentina, inflation is no longer an event. It is a condition of life. People rush to spend wages before value disappears. Trust in national currency vanishes. The economy becomes dollarized in practice, if not law. In Zimbabwe, inflation erased not just savings, but social order. Money ceased to function. Barter replaced currency. Professional classes collapsed. In Lebanon, inflation exposed the fiction of banking stability. Depositors discovered their money never truly existed. A middle class evaporated almost overnight. These are not anomalies. They are extreme expressions of a universal dynamic. Inflation punishes the passive. It rewards the prepared. It protects states until it destroys them. The uncomfortable truth is that inflation will not disappear. It is not a policy error waiting to be corrected. It is a feature of modern monetary systems. The question is not whether inflation will continue. The question is whether individuals will recognize it before it extracts its full cost. Inflation is often presented as a technical problem, a number on a chart, a debate among economists. But history tells a far simpler story. Inflation is not a malfunction of the system. It is one of the system's most reliable tools. From ancient Rome to modern central banks, from paper assignats to digital money created with keystrokes, the pattern never changes. When governments face obligations they cannot meet honestly, inflation becomes the answer. Not because it is fair, not because it is efficient, but because it is quiet. Inflation allows states to take without asking. It dissolves debt without default. It transfers wealth without legislation. And most importantly, it obscures responsibility. No official stands at a podium and announces that your savings will buy less next year. No law is passed, declaring that your labor will be quietly discounted. The erosion happens in the background, spread thin enough that it feels natural, inevitable, almost accidental. That illusion is the true power of inflation. It teaches people to doubt themselves rather than the system, to blame rising prices on luck, markets, or circumstance instead of policy, to work harder while standing still. Once you understand inflation as a hidden tax, the world looks different. Rising asset prices stop feeling like prosperity. Low interest rates stop feeling like generosity. Money itself stops feeling neutral. You begin to see the quiet bargain at the center of modern economies. Governments promise stability. Citizens accept erosion. That bargain holds only as long as inflation remains slow enough to be tolerated and confusing enough to be misunderstood. When it accelerates, trust breaks. When trust breaks, systems fracture. This is why inflation is feared and used at the same time. It is both shield and weapon, both solution and threat. And it is why this story matters now more than ever. Because inflation is not something that might happen to you in the future. It is something you are already paying every single day. If this changed how you see money, power, and policy, share it. And if you want to keep uncovering the forces shaping your economic future, subscribe. History has already written the answers. The question is whether we choose to read them.